The Lost City of Cyra. Chapter 1. The Promise of Immortality. The campfires flickered faintly, casting long, shifting shadows across the desert sands. The night seemed to stretch infinitely, a canvas of emptiness that mirrored the gnawing void inside Alexander's soul. Around him, his men reveled in their victory at Gaugamela, their cheers rising like the smoke from the fire, wild, chaotic, and full of life. They drank and sang, their voices rough but joyous, celebrating the empire their king had carved from the bones of other great civilizations. But Alexander felt none of it. He sat apart, his back to a jagged rock that jutted out from the sands, staring into the flames as if they held some secret he could not yet grasp. He could still hear the clash of swords in his mind, the smell of blood mingling with the dust of battle, but even the sweet taste of triumph had begun to sour. Gaugamela, the heart of Persia, now lay conquered, and yet, what had it given him? Another piece of land, another crown, another fleeting moment of exultation. He looked down at his hands that had wielded weapons and broken empires, and wondered why they still felt so empty. The world is mine, he thought. But it is not enough. The fires crackled, and the wind swept low over the desert, carrying with it the soft murmurs of the night, distant and detached. Alexander's gaze moved upward, toward the vast expanse of stars, a cold and indifferent audience to his victories. The sky stretched out in all directions, endless and unfeeling. It made him feel small. Even with the world at his feet, the stars reminded him how insignificant he remained in the grand theater of time. Victory should not leave you so heavy. The voice, familiar and worn with years of counsel, cut through his brooding thoughts. Ptolemy, his most trusted general, approached with the quiet confidence of a man who had known Alexander long before the glories, long before the world hailed him as great. Ptolemy's weathered face was etched with concern, the kind born not just from loyalty but from friendship, a friendship that stretched back to their youth, before kingdoms were won and lost. Alexander didn't respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the fire. They celebrate in your name, Ptolemy continued, gesturing toward the men who were deep in their drunken songs, clinking their cups together in messy rhythms. They call you the greatest king to ever walk the earth, and yet here you sit, brooding. Alexander finally lifted his gaze from the fire and met Ptolemy's eyes. His friend saw in them the glint of something unsettling, a restlessness that had nothing to do with the empire they had built together. What do they know of greatness? Alexander muttered, his voice low and sharp. Conquering cities, destroying empires. It's all fleeting. In 100 years, who will remember our names? What will be left of us? Ptolemy frowned, sensing the undercurrent of something darker in his king's words. The world will remember you, Alexander. They'll speak of you as a god. A god, Alexander repeated, his tone almost mocking. And yet I grow old. I will die like any other man. What good is it to be a god in the eyes of men when death claims you all the same? Ptolemy remained silent, unsure how to respond. He had seen Alexander's ambition grow with each victory, but this was something else. It wasn't merely hunger for more land, more power, this was deeper, more insidious. This was the slow realization of mortality sinking into the mind of a man who had thought himself beyond it. There must be more, Alexander continued, almost to himself. His hands clenched, knuckles white as they gripped the edge of his cloak. I have taken the world, and yet I am still nothing. The desert wind shifted again, colder this time, and with it came the faint sound of footsteps, a shuffling, deliberate sound that cut through the distant revelry of the soldiers. Ptolemy tensed instinctively, turning toward the noise, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. From the darkness beyond the firelight emerged a figure, a man bent with age, his robes tattered and his eyes gleaming unnaturally in the faint glow of the flames. His movements were slow but purposeful, as though he had walked this earth for longer than anyone could remember. He approached without hesitation, his gaze fixed solely on Alexander. Ptolemy stepped forward, placing himself between the stranger and his king. Who are you? State your purpose before I. But Alexander raised a hand, silencing him. There was something about this old man, something ancient and unsettling, that intrigued him. The stranger's face was etched with lines so deep they looked like cracks in stone, and his eyes, there was something in those eyes that felt far older than even the oldest ruins of Persia. I bring you a gift, the old man rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper, but it carried with it a weight that stilled the air around them. A gift, O King of Kings, from a place older than this world. Alexander's curiosity flared. He gestured for Ptolemy to step aside. What gift could you offer me that I do not already possess? The old man's cracked lips curled into a thin smile. Eternity, he said simply. The word hung in the air between them, heavy and irresistible. Ptolemy's hand tightened around his sword, his instinct screaming that this man was dangerous. Alexander, we don't need this. Send him away. This reeks of madness. But Alexander ignored him, his eyes locked on the old man's, captivated by the promise. Eternity, he repeated softly, as if testing the word in his mouth. Speak more plainly, old man. What do you mean by eternity? The old man's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with a dark, ancient knowledge. There is a city, he began, a city hidden from the world, lost to time. It is called Cyra. Older than Babylon, older than Egypt, Cyra holds the secret to eternal life. The desert wind seemed to still, as if the world itself was waiting for Alexander's response. Eternal life, Alexander whispered, his pulse quickening. This was it. This was what had been gnawing at him, the answer he had been searching for. Conquering empires, ruling over men, it was all meaningless if death awaited him at the end. But if he could live forever, if he could escape the grasp of mortality, then he would truly be a god. Ptolemy stepped forward, his voice low and urgent. Alexander, you don't need this. You've already built a legacy that will last for centuries. Chasing legends, it's not worth the risk. But Alexander barely heard him. His mind was already racing, filled with visions of immortality. He would stand among the stars, ageless, timeless, ruling forever. Where is this city? Alexander asked, his voice sharp with urgency. The old man's eyes glittered in the firelight. Far to the south, across the great desert, lies the entrance to the canyon where Cyra sleeps. I can guide you there. Ptolemy stepped in front of Alexander, his face pale with fear and anger. This is madness. We have an empire to govern, lands to rule. You can't throw it all away for a myth, a story. But Alexander's decision had already been made. He rose to his feet, his eyes blazing with a fire that Ptolemy had seen only in the heat of battle. An empire means nothing if I am not here to rule it. You know that as well as I do. Ptolemy looked at him, searching for some hint of the man he once knew, but all he saw was a king driven to the edge of obsession. He turned to the old man. And what do you want in return for this guidance? The old man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. I want nothing but to see a man claim what he deserves. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest, a strange exhilaration taking hold. This was the answer he had been seeking. Not land, not riches, immortality. We leave at dawn, he said, his voice brooking no argument. A small party, only those who are willing. Ptolemy opened his mouth to protest again, but something in Alexander's eyes silenced him. The king had made his choice, and nothing would sway him. As the old man turned and melted back into the darkness, Ptolemy stood in silence, watching his friend, his king, with a deep sense of dread. Hephaestion, who had remained quiet until now, finally approached, his face pale and strained. You cannot be serious, he said quietly, his voice trembling with the weight of their shared history. This? Cyra. It's a legend. A trap. Alexander didn't meet his gaze. It's my destiny, Hephaestion. The gods have given me a chance to rise above them. I will not turn away. Hephaestion looked at him for a long moment, fear and sorrow swirling in his heart. He had followed Alexander through countless battles, across continents, always believing in his vision. But now he wondered if his friend had crossed a line that could never be undone. As the fires burned low and the desert winds howled softly through the camp, Alexander gazed out at the endless horizon. The promise of immortality shimmered before him like a distant star, and he knew, no matter the cost, he would claim it. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Descent into the desert. The desert stretched out before them, a sea of endless sand, shimmering beneath the relentless sun. Heat waves distorted the horizon, turning the world into a mirage of rippling nothingness. The Macedonian army, reduced to a small contingent of trusted soldiers, marched in silence, their armor clinking faintly with each step. The festive spirits of the campfires were long behind them, replaced now by a grim determination. At the head of the group rode Alexander, his eyes fixed on the endless dunes, seeing far beyond the horizon, to the lost city of Cyra. His mind churned with thoughts of immortality, the promises of eternity offered by the old man replaying over and over in his head like the whisper of the wind. He was driven now, more than ever, not by ambition for land or titles, but by something deeper, something darker, an obsession to transcend the limits of flesh, to escape the finality of death. In the distance, the sun burned low in the sky, its light casting long shadows across the barren landscape, turning the sand into a canvas of deep, brooding oranges and reds. But none of this beauty registered with Alexander. His thoughts were consumed by the city that supposedly lay ahead, buried under centuries of dust, forgotten by all but a few. Behind him, Ptolemy rode in silence, his face etched with worry. The steady rhythm of his horses' hooves did little to calm the storm inside him. He had tried to reason with Alexander back at the camp, had even argued with him, something unheard of among Alexander's men. But the king had brushed aside his concerns, his eyes already too far gone, fixed on the unattainable. Ptolemy knew this was madness, but what could he do? His loyalty to Alexander was deeper than fear. Still, as the desert stretched on with no end in sight, and the men's lips cracked under the relentless heat, the seeds of doubt grew inside him, unsettling his otherwise steady heart. And then there was Hephaestion. He rode closer to Alexander, though even he did not speak. His loyalty was unquestionable, but something gnawed at him now, an unease that had taken root when the old man first spoke of Cyra. Hephaestion had dreams. Dark dreams. He hadn't shared them with anyone, not even Alexander, but each night since they had begun this journey, his sleep had been haunted by visions of statues moving, whispering voices calling to him from the darkness. He'd wake with his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat covering his skin despite the desert heat. He glanced sideways at Alexander. The king's face was hard, set in stone, his mind far away. Hephaestion had seen this look before, on the eve of battle, when Alexander's focus would sharpen to a terrifying point. But this was different. This wasn't the determination of a warrior, this was something more desperate. Alexander, Hephaestion finally said, his voice hesitant, breaking the heavy silence. Alexander didn't turn. "What is it, Hephaestion?" His voice was distant, as if he barely registered his friend's presence. Hephaestion swallowed, his throat dry from the desert air. "We've been marching for days. The men are tired. We could stop, make camp, at least until the worst of the heat passes." The suggestion was reasonable, but Alexander's eyes flashed with impatience. "We're close. I can feel it. We don't stop until we reach the canyon. There will be shelter there." Hephaestion held back a sigh. He knew better than to push further. But something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, an unsettling, creeping dread that had grown stronger with each passing day. The desert felt alive, watching them. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a whisper, just at the edge of hearing. But he said nothing more, because how could he speak of such things when Alexander's mind was set? As they rode on, the horizon began to change. Where once there had been only endless dunes, now jagged rocks jutted out from the sands, the first signs of the canyon the old man had spoken of. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with anticipation. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but they followed their king without question, though they, too, had begun to sense the change. By the time they reached the entrance to the canyon, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The canyon itself was narrow, its walls rising steep and foreboding on either side. The air was cooler here, but it was not a relief. The coolness felt unnatural, as though the desert had suddenly shifted from a pressing heat to an unsettling chill, the kind that crept into your bones. The old man, who had been leading them silently for days, stopped at the canyon's mouth. His face was pale, and the unnatural gleam in his eye seemed to shine even brighter in the dimming light. "This is the entrance to Cyra," he said, his voice rasping like wind over dry bones. "Beyond this canyon, the city awaits." Alexander dismounted, his eyes narrowing as he studied the canyon. It was darker here, as if the sun's rays could no longer penetrate the narrow space. A part of him, deep and primal, felt the weight of the place, the ancient power that seemed to hang in the air. But that only fueled his desire more. He stepped forward, but Ptolemy grabbed his arm. "Alexander, think. This place, it feels wrong." Ptolemy's voice was low, urgent, his fingers gripping tighter than usual, something Alexander noted but chose to ignore for now. "Wrong?" Alexander echoed, pulling his arm free. "What feels wrong to you, Ptolemy? The desert? The rocks? Or is it simply your fear speaking?" Ptolemy's eyes hardened. "It's not fear. It's sense. We're marching into a place that no man has seen for centuries. For good reason, I imagine. We could turn back now. We could still make it home." "Home?" Alexander scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You call Babylon home now? You call half-built cities and squabbling governors our destiny?" Ptolemy stood his ground. "You're chasing a ghost. We've won. We've built an empire. You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore." For a brief moment, something flickered in Alexander's eyes. A hesitation, perhaps. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, determined stare Ptolemy had grown used to seeing. "You never understood, did you?" Alexander said quietly, almost as if to himself. "This was never about proving anything to anyone. This is about what comes next." "And what is that?" Ptolemy demanded, his frustration growing. "What could possibly come after all we've done?" Alexander turned to face him fully, his eyes burning with an intensity that made Ptolemy step back. "Eternity." The word lingered in the air, heavy and final. Ptolemy shook his head, the weight of disappointment settling into his chest. "You've gone mad," he whispered. "All of this for a myth. A legend." Alexander said nothing. He turned back toward the canyon, his mind already beyond the present, beyond Ptolemy, beyond anything that had come before. He walked forward, stepping into the shadows of the canyon, and the others had no choice but to follow. The deeper they went into the canyon, the darker it became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the passage narrowing with each step. The old man moved with purpose, his pace unnaturally fast for someone his age. The men behind him grew restless. They could feel it now too, that sense of being watched, of something ancient lurking just out of sight. Hephaestion's unease grew with every step. His dreams returned to him now in sharp flashes, stone statues with eyes that moved, walls that whispered secrets too terrible to hear. He tried to shake the images from his mind, but they clung to him like the dust of the desert, impossible to escape. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, the path opened suddenly, and there it was, Cyra. The city lay sprawled before them, a monstrous relic swallowed by time, half consumed by the desert sands that rose like waves, threatening to bury its ancient bones forever. Its once proud spires, now dark and jagged, clawed at the sky like the skeletal fingers of a long-dead giant, twisted and broken, but still grasping for something unattainable. The stone was blackened, charred by the touch of centuries, and where the sand had not swallowed the city whole, cracks ran deep through the foundations, like veins of some forgotten beast, pulsing faintly with the remnants of a life long since drained. The towers that had once dominated this landscape stood as crumbling sentinels, their ancient faces scarred by the relentless winds and the weight of millennia. They loomed over the streets below, not in the way of ruins forgotten, but as guardians still on watch, their decayed forms heavy with purpose. The streets themselves, though empty of life, seemed strangely preserved, as if the desert had been commanded to halt its relentless advance, leaving the roads untouched and silent, waiting. Rows of statues flanked the streets, standing in eerie, unnatural silence. Each figure was impossibly tall, carved from stone so black it seemed to drink in the light, their surfaces untouched by the ravages of time. Their faces, horrifically detailed, were not the serene, noble expressions one might expect from a city of gods, but instead, they bore twisted, scornful visages, frozen in expressions of eternal judgment. Eyes that should have been blind seemed to watch, the weight of their gaze so intense it pressed on the soul, making it feel as though each step forward was a transgression, a sin yet to be punished. There was something unnervingly alive about them. The statues did not simply stand as monuments to a forgotten past, they seemed to wait. Their stone mouths, parted ever so slightly, whispered of old gods and ancient rites, as if they had been carved not to commemorate, but to warn. Their eyes followed, not with the coldness of dead stone, but with the malice of something sentient, something hungry. The air itself was thick and oppressive, not merely from the stifling heat of the desert, but from the crushing weight of something far older than the city itself. It seemed to push against the skin, seeping into the lungs like a heavy fog. Every breath was an effort, every movement an intrusion into a place that did not want them there. It was as though the city resented their presence, as though the land itself recoiled at the footsteps of the living. And beneath it all, beneath the silence, beneath the weight, there was a sound, just at the edge of hearing. A soft, rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of the earth itself, slow and ancient, reverberating through the stone and sand, making the ground feel unnervingly alive. It wasn't just a city they had found, it was something more, a tomb, perhaps, but also a mouth, a prison, a beast that had slept too long and was now, slowly, inexorably, beginning to stir. The city of Cyra was not dead. It was waiting. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Alexander seemed struck by the sight before him, the ancient power of the place wrapping itself around them all like a shroud. The city of gods, the old man whispered, his voice trembling with something that might have been reverence or fear. Alexander took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. This was where it would all change. But Hephaestion, standing just behind him, couldn't shake the feeling that they had already crossed a line, that they had entered a place where no man was meant to walk. And the statues, though still, seemed to watch them as they approached. Chapter 3. The City of Shadows. The city of Cyra loomed before them, a monstrous relic half submerged in the sands of time, its spires clawing at the sky like the skeletal hands of something long buried, but not yet dead. There was no grandeur left in it, only decay, stone that had endured the passage of ages but had forgotten its own name, its purpose. The silence that met them was thick, oppressive, as if even the wind refused to speak here. Alexander stood at the edge of the ruins, his breath shallow, his heart racing. He had imagined this moment, finding Cyra, the ancient city lost to myth, the place that promised the immortality he sought. Yet, now that he stood before it, the reality was more unsettling than even his most fevered dreams could have conjured. Cyra was not a city of gods, as the old man had said. It was a tomb, a place where time had come to die. Beside him, Hephaestion shifted uneasily, his eyes tracing the outlines of the massive statues that flanked the crumbling path into the heart of the city. Their faces, weathered but still hauntingly intact, seemed to watch them with an unsettling awareness, their eyes hollow yet full of judgment. He had seen these figures before, in his dreams, and now that they stood before him in the waking world, his dread grew with each passing second. "This place is wrong," Hephaestion whispered, though his words were lost in the vastness around them. He clenched the reins of his horse tighter, fighting the urge to turn back. Alexander, however, was entranced. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the towering structures ahead. "This is it," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "This is where we will find it." Ptolemy rode up beside them, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. His distrust of the old man had only grown since they entered the canyon, and now, seeing this desolate place, that distrust had morphed into something colder, fear. "We should turn back," Ptolemy said, his voice low but firm. "This city, it's no gift. It's a curse. You can feel it, Alexander." "We all can." Alexander did not answer. He walked forward, his steps deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the ruins, as if he were already claiming it as his own. The others had no choice but to follow, their horses' hooves crunching softly against the sand-covered stones. As they moved deeper into Cyra, the air grew heavier, as though the city itself pressed down on them, suffocating their every breath. The statues, dozens of them, stood in silent rows along the main path, their eyes locked on the newcomers, their massive arms crossed over their chests in eternal vigilance. Each one was different, yet they shared the same cold, impassive expressions, as if they had seen everything and judged it unworthy. The deeper they went, the more the men whispered among themselves. The soldiers had followed Alexander through countless battles, had marched beside him into impossible victories, but this was different. The city felt alive, not with people or even memories, but with something darker. Whispers, barely audible at first, seemed to rise from the cracks in the stones, carried on the breath of the windless air. It was as if the very walls were speaking to them, though none dared to listen too closely. Hephaestion glanced at Alexander, his voice tight with anxiety. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, though it was more of a plea. "This place, it's watching us." Alexander didn't turn to him. "What did you expect?" he replied, his tone distant, as though his mind was already far beyond the present. "This is a place of gods. It is only natural that it would watch those who seek to trespass here." "Gods," Hephaestion repeated, his brow furrowing. "Or something else." Ptolemy, riding just behind them, cut in. "Hephaestion is right. This is no holy place. Look around, Alexander. Does this look like the realm of gods to you? It's dead. The city's been dead for centuries. We've come here for nothing." But Alexander's eyes blazed with a fervor that bordered on madness. "No," he said firmly, stopping in his tracks. "Not dead. Not yet." The old man, who had been walking silently at the head of the group, turned then, his pale, sunken face drawn into a thin smile. His presence, always unnerving, had grown more sinister the closer they came to the heart of Cyra. His eyes gleamed in the dimming light, and when he spoke, it was as though the city itself echoed his words. "We are close," he rasped, his voice like sand scraping against stone. "The temple lies just ahead. There, you will find what you seek." Ptolemy dismounted, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword as if ready to strike. "Enough of your riddles. What is this place really? What is it that you've brought us here for?" The old man's smile never wavered. "The city of Cyra holds the secret of eternity. It is up to you to decide whether you are worthy of it." Alexander stepped forward, brushing past Ptolemy, his gaze locked on the massive structure that loomed ahead, a temple carved from black stone, its towering pillars covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to writhe in the shadows. The air around it was colder than the rest of the city, as though the temple itself sucked the warmth from the world. He could feel the pull of it, the promise that had drawn him here, and without hesitation, he began to climb the steps that led to its entrance. "Alexander, stop!" Ptolemy shouted, grabbing his arm. "Don't you see what this is? It's a trap. The old man's been leading us here for something darker than we imagined. You need to turn back before it's too late." Alexander yanked his arm free, his eyes wild. "Too late? For what? You've seen what we've conquered. You've seen the world fall before us. This is the final victory. This is what all of it has been for. To live forever, to be more than men." Ptolemy stared at him, his disbelief turning to anger. "We are men, Alexander. And chasing this madness will get us all killed." But Alexander had already turned away, his feet carrying him toward the temple's darkened entrance. Inside, the air was colder still, the darkness deeper. The walls of the temple were lined with statues, smaller versions of the ones outside, their eyes blank but focused, as if waiting for something. At the center of the chamber was a pool, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the faint light that filtered in from the entrance. The water seemed unnaturally still, untouched by time or the dust of the ages. "This is it," the old man whispered from behind them. "The fountain of eternity." Hephaestion took a step back, but Alexander was already moving toward the pool, his steps slow and deliberate. The closer he came, the more the whispers in the air seemed to intensify, swirling around him like invisible hands, urging him forward. He knelt at the edge of the pool, staring into its depths. For a moment, all was silent. And then, his reflection in the water began to shift. His face, once youthful and powerful, began to wither before his eyes, his skin sagging, his hair turning white, his body collapsing in on itself. He recoiled, but the vision persisted, showing him a future where his glory was reduced to dust. Hephaestion rushed forward, grabbing his shoulder. "Alexander, don't! We have to leave now." But Alexander couldn't look away. "This is the price," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is what it takes." He reached for the water, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the surface. And then, outside, a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the city. The statues had begun to move. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Price of Immortality. The rumble that echoed from outside the temple was unlike anything Alexander had ever heard. It was deep, guttural, as though the earth itself had begun to wake, disturbed by the audacity of mortal men. Dust fell from the ceiling of the temple, the stone walls groaning with the strain of time and power long dormant. Yet Alexander remained kneeling by the pool, his gaze locked on his own shifting reflection, transfixed by the grotesque image of his aging, decaying face. His hand hovered just above the surface of the water, trembling, the ripples forming beneath his fingers as if the water itself was alive, calling him forward. He could feel the weight of eternity pressing down on him, so close, so tangible. He could almost taste it. This was what he had fought for, bled for. This was what he had spent his entire life seeking. To be a god, to outlive the very concept of death. Behind him, Hephaestion was frantic, his voice trembling with panic. "Alexander, we have to go. Something's happening, can't you hear it? The city, the statues are moving." But Alexander did not move. His eyes were glazed, consumed by a hunger that had devoured his soul. He was too far gone, lost in the pool of the water, the promise of something more. "Alexander!" Hephaestion shouted, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him away from the pool with all his strength. "This isn't right. We were never meant to find this place." Alexander snapped out of his trance and spun around, fury flashing in his eyes. "You don't understand," he growled. "This is everything. I have come too far to turn back now." Before Hephaestion could argue, another loud crack echoed through the temple. The statues outside had come to life. Ptolemy, standing at the entrance of the temple, his sword drawn, stared in horror as the massive stone figures began to move. The once still, impassive faces twisted into something almost sentient, their eyes glowing with an eerie, cold light. They were enormous, towering over the ruins, their stone limbs groaning as they shifted into motion. The soldiers outside scrambled, panic spreading like wildfire as the statues advanced. Lysimachus, now frail and weakened from the curse of the desert, staggered toward Ptolemy, his voice barely audible over the noise. "The city, it's alive, it was never a gift, we've been fooled." Ptolemy's eyes narrowed, fury mixing with terror. "Alexander!" He shouted into the temple, turning back just as the first statue began to lift its enormous stone arm. "We have to leave now, or we're all dead." Inside, Alexander's gaze flicked between the pool and his men, torn between the ancient promise of immortality and the loyalty of those who had followed him into the darkness. He could hear the chaos erupting outside, the screams of men as they were crushed beneath the weight of the stone guardians. His heart pounded in his chest. He had come so far, and now the city itself was turning against him. But then, the old man appeared once more, his sunken eyes gleaming with a twisted delight, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "You see now, don't you?" He rasped, his lips curling into a thin, cruel smile. "The price of eternity is not life. It is death." Alexander's blood ran cold as he turned to face him, the weight of realization crashing over him. The old man had known all along. Cyra was not a city of gods, it was a city of the dead. A trap, a prison designed to lure the greedy and the ambitious into its depths, feeding off their hunger for power, their thirst for immortality. "This was never about granting you eternal life," the old man continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You are nothing but a sacrifice. The city demands it, as it has for centuries. Those who come here seeking immortality find only death, and worse." A sickening feeling twisted in Alexander's gut as he looked around the temple, the ancient carvings on the walls shifting in the flickering light, revealing scenes of men, kings, warriors, conquerors, who had come before him, their faces twisted in agony as they were consumed by the city's dark power. The fountain of eternity had never been a fountain of life. It was a well of souls, a place where the city fed on those foolish enough to seek it out. The whispers that had haunted them since they entered the canyon grew louder, rising into a chorus of voices, the voices of the dead, the voices of those who had once stood where Alexander now knelt. "Immortality," the old man hissed, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with a sick joy. "But not for you. Not for you." And then, In that moment, the truth struck like a lightning bolt through Alexander's mind, a truth so horrifying, so devastating, that it left him gasping for breath. The old man wasn't some wandering sage. He wasn't a guide. He was the last king of Cyra. Centuries ago, he had stood exactly where Alexander now stood, kneeling before the pool, seeking the same promise of eternity. But the city had taken him, twisted him, trapping him in an endless cycle, forever tied to the fate of Cyra, forced to lure others into its grasp to keep the city alive. He had become part of the city's curse, an immortal in the worst possible way, a slave to its hunger, never able to die, never able to escape. And now, he wanted to pass that curse on. "You were never meant to leave this place," the old man whispered, his voice soft but sharp, like a dagger slipping between ribs. "You are the next king of Cyra. You will stay here, as I have, for eternity. This is your fate." Alexander recoiled, stumbling back, his mind reeling. The walls of the temple seemed to close in around him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, filling his head with the voices of those who had been trapped before him. "No," Alexander gasped, shaking his head, his vision blurring. "No. I am not like you." But the old man only laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "You already are. You just don't know it yet." Outside, the chaos grew worse. The statues were closing in, their massive stone limbs crashing down on the soldiers, who fought in vain to hold them back. Ptolemy, his sword drawn, slashed at one of the statue's legs, but the blade bounced off the stone, useless. He turned toward the temple, desperation clawing at him. "Alexander," he shouted. "Do something." But Alexander stood frozen, his mind trapped in a whirlwind of fear and realization. The city was alive. The city wanted him. He would become the next prisoner, bound to its dark will, just like the old man. The old man had been its servant for centuries, luring kings and conquerors into Cyra to feed the city's endless hunger for souls. Hephaestion grabbed Alexander by the arm, his voice breaking through the storm. "We have to go. Now." But Alexander could not move. His gaze was locked on the old man, whose face twisted into something grotesque, his skin seeming to wither and crack, like the statues outside. His form flickered, becoming less human and more a part of the city itself, as though he was merging with the stone walls around him. "You are already mine," the old man whispered, his voice echoing in Alexander's mind. "The moment you stepped foot in Cyra, you were mine." "No!" Alexander screamed, pulling free from Hephaestion, backing away from the pool, from the old man, from the terrible truth that had consumed him. But it was too late. The ground trembled, the statues outside marching ever closer, the very fabric of the city shifting, as if it were preparing to swallow them whole. In one final, desperate act, Alexander turned and ran, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He fled from the temple, from the old man's laughter, from the cursed city that had ensnared him. Hephaestion and Ptolemy followed close behind, their only thought to escape. But as they fled through the ruins, past the silent, watching statues, Alexander knew one thing with terrifying certainty. He would never truly escape Cyra. Chapter 5. The Flight from Cyra. The temple's darkness seemed to cling to them as they burst out into the cold air of Cyra, the cursed city's grip tightening with every step. The world outside was no longer the one they had entered. The statues that lined the streets had fully awakened, their stone eyes glowing with malevolent intent, limbs moving with a slow, deliberate malice. The ground beneath them shook with the weight of ancient power, the city itself trembling as if in response to their presence. Alexander, Hephaestion, and Ptolemy ran with desperation, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Behind them, the old man's voice echoed through the ruins, a disembodied cackle that reverberated off the crumbling walls, as if the city itself was laughing at them. The statues, once silent guardians, now moved with terrifying purpose, closing in with each passing moment. "We have to get to the canyon," Ptolemy shouted, his voice barely audible over the low rumble that filled the air. The ground seemed to tilt beneath them, the sand shifting, like the city itself was trying to pull them back into its depths. Alexander stumbled, his legs heavy, his mind clouded with the old man's final words, "You are already mine." The weight of the curse pressed down on him like a suffocating fog, and he felt its pull deep in his bones. No matter how far they ran, no matter how fast, part of him knew they could never escape the dark reach of Cyra. Hephaestion grabbed his arm, pulling him forward. Move! We can't stop. Alexander blinked, the world coming back into focus. He glanced at Hephaestion, his friend's eyes wide with fear, but his loyalty undiminished. Despite everything, Hephaestion still believed they could make it out. And maybe that was all Alexander needed to keep going. They ran through the narrow streets, their footsteps echoing off the ancient stones. Around them, the statues moved with unnatural slowness, but their sheer size and weight made them unstoppable. Each one towered over the ruined city, massive stone limbs grinding as they stepped forward. They moved as though driven by an unseen force, their faces devoid of emotion, yet filled with a strange, ancient intelligence. One of the statues swung its arm toward them, a massive stone hand crashing into the ground just behind Ptolemy, sending sand and debris flying. He staggered, barely keeping his balance as the ground shuddered beneath him. Go! Don't stop! Ptolemy urged, drawing his sword in a futile gesture of defiance. He knew the blade was useless against these monolithic creatures, but it was all he had. All any of them had was their will to survive. Alexander's eyes darted to the towering structures that surrounded them, once majestic but now crumbling under the weight of centuries. The statues advanced, slow but inevitable, like the march of time itself. Their movements were methodical, precise, as though they were fulfilling a dark, ancient ritual. We can't outrun them forever! Hephaestion shouted, his voice tight with panic. The canyon loomed ahead, a jagged scar in the desert that promised some small hope of escape. If they could reach the narrow passage before the statues closed in, the tight space might offer them protection. It was their only chance. But Alexander knew better now. The city wasn't just some long-forgotten ruin. It was alive. It had drawn them in, whispered promises of immortality, and now it demanded payment. They reached the edge of the city, the statues still lumbering behind them, and plunged into the narrow canyon, their bodies brushing against the rough stone walls as they ran. The air here was cooler, the shadows deeper. The towering rock faces on either side offered a temporary reprieve from the gaze of the statues, but the rumble of their pursuit continued, echoing through the canyon like the growl of some great beast. Ptolemy stopped, panting, his sword still drawn. We've bought ourselves some time, but it won't be long before they find a way through. Hephaestion leaned against the canyon wall, his chest heaving. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his eyes darted nervously toward the way they had come. What now? How do we outrun something that doesn't tire, that doesn't stop? Alexander's mind raced, the old man's words still gnawing at him. The city demands a sacrifice. He could feel it, deep inside. Cyra wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, an ancient power that fed on ambition, on greed, on the souls of those who sought to cheat death. We have to destroy it, Alexander said, his voice low, almost resigned. Ptolemy and Hephaestion stared at him, disbelief etched across their faces. Destroy it? Ptolemy echoed, his tone incredulous. How? You've seen what this place is. We can barely escape, let alone destroy it. But Alexander wasn't listening. His mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the city's curse. The old man had spoken of Cyra as a trap, a prison. And traps could be sprung, prisons could be torn down. The statues, Alexander muttered, his eyes narrowing as the pieces began to fall into place. They're connected to the city. They're its guardians, its protectors. If we can somehow sever that connection. Hephaestion shook his head, his voice trembling with frustration. And how do you propose we do that? We don't even understand what's driving them. Alexander's eyes flickered toward the canyon walls, his gaze sharpening. There's something more. The city is feeding on something. It's why the statues move, why the city itself feels alive. If we can break that connection, we might be able to stop it. And how do we do that? Ptolemy asked, his voice edged with desperation. But before Alexander could answer, the canyon trembled. The statues had reached the entrance, their massive stone forms scraping against the narrow passage as they forced their way in. The sound of grinding stone filled the air, and the men's hearts sank. They're coming! Hephaestion shouted, grabbing Alexander's arm. "We have to move." But Alexander stood his ground, his gaze fixed on the rock walls around them. "No," he said softly. "We can't keep running." He scanned the canyon, his mind racing. If the statues were part of the city, then the city's power had to be centered somewhere they could disrupt it. His eyes fell on a series of cracks running along the canyon walls, deep fissures in the stone. "There," he said, pointing. "The canyon is weak here. If we can bring it down, we might be able to crush them." Ptolemy stared at the cracks, his brow furrowing. "You want to bring the whole canyon down? On top of us?" "It's the only way," Alexander said, his voice hard with resolve. "If we don't, the statues will catch us, and it won't matter how far we run. They'll keep coming." Hephaestion's face was pale, fear flashing in his eyes, but he nodded. "Do it. Whatever it takes." Ptolemy gritted his teeth and sheathed his sword, moving to the wall where the cracks spread like veins through the stone. "If this kills us, I'm blaming you." Alexander ignored the comment, grabbing a heavy rock from the ground and slamming it against the fissures. The stone groaned under the impact, the cracks widening. The canyon wall shuddered, dust raining down from above as the men pounded at the weak points in the rock. Behind them, the statues forced their way deeper into the canyon, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. The rumble of their approach grew louder, the sound of inevitability. "Hurry!" Hephaestion shouted, slamming his own rock against the wall with renewed desperation. The ground beneath them began to tremble, the cracks spreading further, deeper. Alexander could feel the canyon groaning, straining under the pressure. It wouldn't take much more. With one final blow, the wall gave way. The canyon erupted in a deafening roar as the stone above them collapsed, boulders crashing down from the cliffs in a massive rock slide. The statues, caught in the falling debris, were buried under the weight of the canyon's collapse, their stone forms shattered, crushed by the very earth they had once guarded. Alexander, Ptolemy, and Hephaestion dove for cover, their bodies thrown to the ground by the force of the collapse. Dust filled the air, choking them, the sound of crashing rocks drowning out everything. For a long moment, the world was nothing but chaos, noise, and destruction. And then, slowly, the dust began to settle. Silence. The rumble of the statues had stopped. Alexander lifted his head, coughing, his body aching from the impact. He looked around, the canyon now a scene of devastation, rocks and debris piled high where the statues had once stood. They had done it. But as Alexander rose to his feet, a cold realization settled over him. They had escaped the statues. But they had not escaped Cyra. Chapter 6. Chapter 6, Bound to the City. The dust settled around them, a thick, choking haze that clung to their skin and filled their lungs. The rumble of the statues had ceased, and in the sudden, unnerving silence, the three men stood amidst the ruins of the collapsed canyon, their bodies bruised, but alive. The ground was littered with shattered stone, jagged boulders, and fragments of the once immovable statues that had pursued them. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope, a sense that they had finally outrun the ancient city's grasp. But the air was too still. The silence, too complete. It was the silence of a predator waiting just beyond sight, hidden in the darkness. Alexander pushed himself to his feet, his limbs heavy, his heart still hammering in his chest from the effort and the fear. He wiped the dust from his face with a shaking hand, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Around him, the walls of the canyon now seemed to loom even higher, closing them in, as though Cyra's very bones had shifted to trap them. And perhaps they had. Ptolemy, groaning, staggered upright, brushing the dirt from his armor. His face was pale beneath the grime, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it," he muttered, though his voice was more hollow than triumphant. "We brought it down." But Hephaestion, who stood just a few paces away, was not celebrating. His eyes darted nervously between the crumbling canyon walls and the ruins of Cyra beyond. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The city had not been defeated. They had merely bought themselves time that was slipping away with every heartbeat. "We may have stopped the statues," Hephaestion said, his voice tight, "but the city, it's still alive, Alexander. You know it." Alexander turned toward him, and for the first time since they had set foot in Cyra, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He had felt the same thing, an awareness, something far older than the statues, watching them still. The old man's words echoed in his mind, "You are already mine." Ptolemy's brow furrowed as he sheathed his sword, his voice growing more insistent. "We need to leave, Alexander. We need to get out of this cursed place before it takes us all." His eyes were pleading, searching for some shred of the man he had once followed without question. But that man, the Alexander who led them through battle after battle, had changed. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt powerless. He had always believed in his own destiny, that the gods themselves had marked him for greatness, had led him to the edges of the world to claim it. But standing here, surrounded by the ruins of a city that had outlived empires, a city that had swallowed conquerors whole, he realized the terrible truth. There was no escaping Cyra. Alexander's breath quickened, his mind racing. The old man. His voice was hoarse, broken. He knew what this place was. He was a part of it. And now. He stopped, unable to finish the thought, as if speaking the words would make them real. "Now you are, too," Hephaestion finished for him, his voice barely more than a whisper. Alexander's gaze snapped to Hephaestion, and for a moment, a terrible clarity passed between them. Hephaestion had seen it before anyone else. He had known the moment they had entered Cyra that something dark was waiting for them, something ancient and hungry. And now, it was devouring Alexander piece by piece. "No," Alexander said, his voice trembling. "No. I can still." But before he could finish, the ground beneath their feet shifted, a low groan echoing through the canyon. The city was stirring again, its power rippling through the earth like a great beast waking from slumber. Ptolemy cursed, backing away toward the entrance of the canyon, his sword once again drawn. "This place, it's not going to let us leave, is it?" Hephaestion looked at Alexander, fear flashing in his eyes. "We have to try. There's still time." But Alexander stood rooted to the spot, his eyes unfocused, his mind slipping deeper into the city's thrall. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. They were seductive, promising him everything he had ever desired: immortality, power beyond imagination, a kingdom that would never fall. "You cannot leave," the whispers said, in voices both familiar and foreign. "You are bound to this place now. You are Cyra's king." The word struck him like a blow. King. The city wasn't just a tomb for those who had come seeking its power. It was a living entity, feeding on the souls of those foolish enough to seek its secrets. And now, it wanted him. "Alexander!" Ptolemy's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp and urgent. "We have to go." But Alexander could not move. He was trapped between the life he had lived and the future that had been stolen from him. He had come seeking immortality, and now it was being offered to him in the worst possible way. He could feel Cyra wrapping itself around him, pulling him deeper into its ancient web. The city wasn't just alive, it was a parasite, feeding on the ambitions of the men who found it. The old man had been its last victim, bound to the city for eternity, forced to lure others into its grasp. And now, Alexander was to take his place. "I can't leave," Alexander whispered, his voice distant. I belong here." "No." Hephaestion shouted, grabbing him by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "You are not the king of this cursed city. You are Alexander. You've conquered the world, don't let this place take you." But Alexander barely heard him. The whispers had grown louder, overwhelming him, drowning out everything else. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, the souls of those who had come before him, calling him to join them. Hephaestion's grip tightened, his voice breaking. "Please, Alexander. Don't do this. Don't leave us behind." For a brief moment, Alexander's gaze cleared, and he looked at Hephaestion, truly seeing him for the first time since they had entered Cyra. The fear in his friend's eyes, the loyalty that had carried them both through every battle, every hardship. Hephaestion had always been there, always believed in him, even when no one else did. "I?" Alexander's voice faltered, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to leave. He wanted to fight. But the city's pull was too strong. Ptolemy, standing at the edge of the canyon, his sword drawn, shouted one last desperate plea. "Alexander, listen to him. This city is trying to claim you. You're stronger than this." But it was too late. The ground beneath them split open, a massive crack running through the canyon floor, the earth itself heaving as Cyra's power surged to the surface. Stone crumbled around them, the canyon walls collapsing as the city's final act of defiance began. Hephaestion stumbled back, pulling Alexander with him as the ground gave way beneath their feet. "We have to move." But Alexander's legs refused to cooperate. He felt as if he were sinking, the city pulling him down, deeper into the abyss that had opened beneath them. He could hear the voices of the dead, the souls of the kings and conquerors who had been trapped here before him, calling his name. "You cannot leave," the voices hissed. "You are one of us now." Hephaestion's grip on him tightened, his voice trembling with desperation. "No. I won't let you stay here." But Alexander's body felt heavier with each passing moment, his mind clouded with the ancient curse that now gripped him. I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ptolemy rushed toward them, his eyes wide with panic. "Hephaestion, we have to go. The whole canyon is coming down." But Hephaestion refused to let go. "I'm not leaving without him." Alexander's vision blurred, the edges of his world growing darker. He could feel Cyra pulling him under, deeper into its grasp. But Hephaestion's grip on him never wavered. And then, in one final, desperate act, Hephaestion did the only thing he could. With a cry of anguish, he shoved Alexander away from the edge of the abyss, pushing him toward Ptolemy and the collapsing canyon. "Run!" Alexander stumbled, his body still heavy with the weight of the curse, but he managed to stay on his feet. He turned, his eyes wide with disbelief, as Hephaestion remained standing at the edge of the crack, the ground splitting further beneath him. "No!" Alexander shouted, reaching out, but Ptolemy grabbed him, pulling him back toward the exit. Hephaestion's face was pale, but there was a calmness in his eyes, a finality. "You have to live, Alexander. You have to leave this place. I won't let it take you." The ground beneath him gave way, and Hephaestion fell, swallowed by the darkness below, his final words lost in the roar of the collapsing canyon. Alexander screamed, but Ptolemy dragged him away, pulling him toward the light, toward the open desert that lay beyond the city's reach. And then, as the canyon collapsed behind them, the city of Cyra was silent once more. Chapter 7. The abyss beckons. The wind howled across the desert like a dying breath, carrying with it the scent of ancient dust, as if the sand itself were whispering warnings from long-dead tongues. Alexander stood at the edge of the collapsed canyon, staring into the endless expanse of desert ahead. But the horizon, which should have offered freedom, stretched out like a hollow dream. He could feel the pull of Cyra behind him, no longer just a city, but a part of him now. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong from the moment they entered the city, and no matter how far they ran, that wrongness had followed them into the wasteland. He heard Ptolemy beside him, panting, his breath ragged from the frantic escape. But even in the silence, even in the brief moment of respite, something gnawed at the edges of Alexander's consciousness. The sense of wrongness clung to the air, to his very skin, like the city's invisible hand still wrapped around his throat. "We need to keep moving," Ptolemy said, his voice rough but steady. "We need to get as far away from here as we can." But Alexander didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his heart beating too quickly, too erratically. "Do you feel it?" he whispered, though the words were barely audible over the sound of the wind. Ptolemy turned toward him, frowning. "Feel what?" Alexander's hands clenched at his sides. "We didn't leave. We never left." Ptolemy's frown deepened, his confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" "We made it out of the canyon. The statues, the city, they're gone. We're free." But Alexander's mind was unraveling, piece by piece, the threads of reason slipping through his fingers. He could feel it, the city, the curse, the weight of something ancient and terrible still pressing down on them. "It's still here," he muttered, his voice growing more frantic. "Cyra, it's still here with us." Ptolemy stepped forward, placing a hand on Alexander's shoulder, his grip firm. Alexander, listen to me. We destroyed the statues. The city collapsed. We survived. No. Alexander shook his head violently, pulling away from Ptolemy's grasp. No, you don't understand. Cyra isn't just a place. It's something more. It's alive. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, an almost imperceptible whisper, like the breath of the desert itself, speaking in a language neither man could understand. But it was there, lingering just beyond hearing, filling the space between their thoughts. And then Alexander saw it. Footprints. Leading away from the collapsed canyon, stretching out into the desert, just ahead of them. They weren't theirs. They couldn't be. The shape of the tracks was all wrong, too light, too shallow, as if whoever, or whatever, had left them didn't belong to the world of men. Ptolemy's eyes followed Alexander's gaze, and when he saw the footprints, his face went pale. "What is this?" he murmured, his voice laced with dread. "We're the only ones out here." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His mind reeled, torn between the reality of what lay before him and the impossible truth he was beginning to grasp. The footprints stretched out into the desert, their destination unclear, but their origin undeniable. They led away from the abyss that had swallowed Hephaestion. The ground there had collapsed, buried under the weight of Cyra's ruin, and yet the footprints continued, too clean, too precise, as though untouched by the chaos they had left behind. "Hephaestion," Alexander whispered, his voice breaking. He stepped forward, following the path of the footprints, his pulse racing in his ears. The desert around them seemed to shift, the very air thickening as though reality itself were bending. Ptolemy followed close behind, his face twisted with confusion, his hand instinctively gripping the hilt of his sword. "Alexander!" Ptolemy called out, his voice tight with fear. "Stop! This isn't." But Alexander had already started moving, his feet carrying him forward, as if pulled by an invisible thread. His mind refused to process what he knew to be true, and yet some part of him, deep and primal, understood it completely. Hephaestion was gone, buried beneath Cyra's weight. And yet, the figure appeared at the edge of the horizon, faint at first, a silhouette against the dying light of the sun. Alexander's heart lurched in his chest. The shape was familiar, impossibly so. A figure standing still in the distance, unmoving, waiting. Ptolemy saw it too, and his grip on Alexander's arm tightened. "No," he breathed. "It can't be." But Alexander broke free of his grasp, his legs moving faster now, his body driven by a desperate, irrational hope. He stumbled over the sand, his heart pounding, the wind whipping against his face. He knew it was impossible, but there, just beyond reach, stood Hephaestion. His back was turned to them, his body still and rigid. It was as if the world had frozen, as though time itself had stopped for him. "Hephaestion!" Alexander shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "Hephaestion!" The figure didn't move. Ptolemy was shouting behind him, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind, but Alexander couldn't stop. He had to reach him. He had to know. His heart screamed at him, his soul reaching out for the friend he had lost, the brother who had fallen into the depths of Cyra. How could this be? How could he stand there, untouched, whole, after everything that had happened? He reached the figure, breathless, his hand shaking as he reached out, as if afraid that the moment he touched him, Hephaestion would vanish like a mirage. But then, slowly, the figure turned. It was Hephaestion, or at least, it wore Hephaestion's face. But something was terribly, horribly wrong. His eyes, once full of life, were now hollow, blackened pits, as though the light of his soul had been snuffed out. His skin was pale, too pale, and his movements unnatural, like the slow, mechanical turning of a marionette's head on a broken string. "Hephaestion?" Alexander's voice wavered, the word barely escaping his lips. He took a step back, his body trembling as the truth began to sink in. This wasn't his friend. This wasn't Hephaestion at all. The thing that wore Hephaestion's face smiled, a grotesque, twisted smile that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too unnatural. And then, it spoke. "You cannot leave," it whispered, its voice a distorted mockery of Hephaestion's, layered with the whispers of the city itself. You were never meant to leave. Alexander staggered backward, his heart pounding in his chest. No, he gasped, shaking his head. This isn't real. But the thing that had once been Hephaestion stepped forward, its hollow eyes fixed on Alexander, its smile widening. Cyra is not a place, it rasped, its voice echoing like the wind through the canyon. It is a living thing. And you are part of it now. Alexander's blood ran cold. He could feel it now, the terrible weight of Cyra pressing down on him, pulling him back, deeper into the curse that had ensnared them all. They had never escaped. They had never left the city. Cyra had followed them, consumed them, and now it was using Hephaestion as a vessel, a twisted, cruel reminder of the friend Alexander had lost. Ptolemy's voice cut through the madness, desperate and full of fear. Alexander! Get away from it! But Alexander couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen with horror. The thing that had once been Hephaestion took another step closer, its smile never fading, its eyes locked on him with a terrible, hungry intensity. You are the king of Cyra now, it whispered, the word sending a jolt of dread through Alexander's body. The city needs you. It has always needed you. Alexander's breath came in ragged gasps, his mind spinning as the weight of the words crashed over him. He had come to Cyra seeking immortality, and now he was trapped in its endless cycle. The old man had known. The old man had seen it all before. The city wasn't just a tomb, it was a living entity, feeding on the ambition and greed of those who sought its secrets. And now, Alexander had taken his place in that eternal nightmare. The ground beneath them trembled, the wind whipping into a frenzy as the desert around them began to shift. The horizon blurred, the landscape warping and twisting as if reality itself were unraveling. The footprints that had led them here began to fade, swallowed by the shifting sand, and the sky above darkened, the stars disappearing one by one. Ptolemy rushed forward, grabbing Alexander by the arm, his face pale with terror. We have to leave, Alexander! Now! But Alexander's gaze remained fixed on the thing wearing Hephaestion's face. He could feel Cyra's pull, the city's dark tendrils wrapping around him, pulling him back into its depths. It was inside him now, a part of him, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he knew the truth. He belonged to Cyra. With a final, chilling smile, the thing that had once been Hephaestion reached out, its hand brushing against Alexander's chest. The touch was cold, colder than the desert night, colder than death itself. You cannot leave, it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. You are already home. And then, in an instant, the world around them shattered. The desert, the sky, the canyon, everything fractured like glass, breaking apart in a cascade of light and sound. Alexander stumbled, his vision blurring, his mind reeling as the fabric of reality itself seemed to tear apart. He heard Ptolemy's voice, distant, calling his name, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos that engulfed them. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The world snapped back into place, the desert once again silent, the wind still. But something had changed. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The sky was darker now, the stars cold and distant, as if the universe itself had shifted. Alexander looked around, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Ptolemy was beside him, his face ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. But Hephaestion, no, the thing that had worn his face, was gone. The footprints had vanished, and the desert was empty once more. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind, carrying with it the memory of the city they had left behind. And then, slowly, Alexander turned toward the horizon, his heart heavy with the terrible knowledge of what they had become. They had escaped Cyra. But Cyra had not let them go. Chapter 8. The final whisper. The desert was silent, but the silence wasn't the peaceful stillness of an empty wasteland. It was a silence filled with tension, with a heaviness that settled deep into the bones, a weight that pressed on Alexander and Ptolemy as they stood in the stillness, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The wind had stilled, the stars above had grown distant and cold, and the desert itself felt wrong. They had escaped Cyra's ruins, but the city had never truly let them go. Alexander's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest heaving as if the very air had grown too thick to breathe. His mind was clouded with a mixture of grief, confusion, and the lingering touch of something dark and ancient that still gripped his heart. Hephaestion, no, whatever had been wearing Hephaestion's face, was gone, but the words it had spoken lingered, echoing in Alexander's mind like a curse: "You cannot leave. You are already home." He felt it now, more acutely than ever, the pull of the city. It wasn't just behind him, it was inside him, woven into the very fabric of his being. His soul had been touched by something far older and darker than any man could comprehend, and no matter how far he ran, he knew he would never truly escape. Cyra had marked him, claimed him, and there was no shaking its grip. Ptolemy, standing beside him, was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had always been the rational one, the grounded general who had followed Alexander through every conquest with an unwavering sense of purpose. But now, even Ptolemy seemed broken, his grip on his sword weak, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of Cyra's curse had finally crushed his spirit. "We have to keep moving," Ptolemy whispered, though his voice lacked the conviction it once had. It was as if he were saying the words simply to stave off the silence. He glanced nervously around the dark desert, as if expecting the city to rise out of the sand at any moment and pull them back into its depths. "We can't stay here. We need to find the others, the men." Alexander shook his head slowly, his eyes distant, unfocused. "There are no others," he said, his voice hollow. "There is no escape." Ptolemy's brow furrowed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you talking about?" "We destroyed the statues. The canyon collapsed. We made it out." "No," Alexander's voice cut through Ptolemy's words, sharp and cold. "We didn't make it out. We never left. Cyra isn't just a city, Ptolemy. It's alive. It's everywhere." Ptolemy took a step back, his hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of his sword. "You're not making sense, Alexander. You're letting the fear get to you." But Alexander knew better. He could feel it, deep inside, the same way he had felt it the moment he had stepped into Cyra's cursed walls. The city wasn't just behind them, it was part of them now, part of him. No matter how far they ran, they were still within its reach. "I can feel it," Alexander muttered, his eyes wide, unblinking. "It's still inside me. The city, it's using us." Ptolemy took another step back, his confusion giving way to fear. He had seen Alexander obsessed before, driven to the brink by ambition and power, but this was different. This wasn't the Alexander he had followed across continents, through blood and glory. This was a man broken by something far beyond his control. "We need to keep moving," Ptolemy said again, more firmly this time. "If we get far enough away, if we can find the men, we can." "There are no men," Alexander interrupted, his voice tight with despair. "They're gone. Just like Hephaestion." The name sent a pang through his heart. Hephaestion, the one person who had always been by his side, had been claimed by Cyra's curse. Or worse, had become part of it. And now, as Alexander stood on the edge of reason, he felt that same pull, that same inevitable descent into the darkness that had taken his closest friend. Ptolemy opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the ground beneath their feet shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint tremor that ran through the sand, but it quickly grew stronger, the earth beneath them rumbling as though something deep below the surface was waking. The wind picked up, howling through the desert with a sudden fury. The sand rose in thick clouds, swirling around them, obscuring their vision. Ptolemy drew his sword, his eyes darting wildly as he tried to make sense of the sudden shift. "What's happening?" he shouted over the roar of the wind. But Alexander didn't answer. He was staring into the swirling sand, his heart pounding in his chest as the whispers began again, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with every passing second. "You cannot leave," the voices hissed, their words carried on the wind, wrapping around him like a noose. "You are bound to us." Alexander staggered backward, his hands pressing against his ears in a futile attempt to block out the voices. But they were inside him now, inside his mind, inside his soul. The desert around them was changing, warping, the very landscape bending to the will of the ancient curse that had claimed them. Ptolemy's voice cut through the chaos, panicked and desperate. "Alexander! We have to move! Now!" But Alexander couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, the pull of Cyra stronger than ever. He could feel the city's dark tendrils wrapping around his mind, drawing him back, pulling him deeper into its web. The wind howled louder, and through the swirling sand, shapes began to emerge, faint, ghostly figures moving through the storm. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and distant. But as the wind carried the sand higher, they became clearer. Statues, the same statues that had once stood sentinel over Cyra's cursed streets, were now moving through the desert, their stone faces twisted into grotesque smiles, their eyes glowing with the same cold, malevolent light that Alexander had seen in the city. Ptolemy saw them too, his face going pale as he stumbled back. No. This can't be happening. But it was happening. The city had followed them, its curse reaching out across the desert, refusing to let them go. The statues moved slowly, their massive stone forms grinding against the sand as they advanced, their eyes locked on Alexander. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and the sand beneath Alexander's feet began to sink. He looked down in horror as the earth gave way, a deep crack opening beneath him, as though the very desert was swallowing him whole. Ptolemy rushed forward, grabbing Alexander's arm and pulling him back from the edge. "Come on," he shouted. "We have to run." But Alexander's legs refused to move. His body was heavy, weighed down by the invisible chains of Cyra's curse. He could feel the city pulling him back, dragging him toward the abyss that had opened beneath them. The statues drew closer, their faces now fully visible through the storm. And behind them, just beyond the edge of the swirling sand, Alexander saw something else. A figure, standing perfectly still, its form obscured by the storm but unmistakable. Hephaestion! He stood at the edge of the desert, watching, his eyes glowing with the same cold light as the statues. His body was still, rigid, as though waiting for something. "No," Alexander gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. Hephaestion! But it wasn't Hephaestion. Not anymore. Whatever had once been his friend was gone, consumed by Cyra's curse, twisted into something dark and terrible. The figure smiled, the same grotesque smile that Alexander had seen before, and as the wind howled, its voice joined the chorus of whispers. "You are one of us now." Ptolemy tugged at Alexander's arm, his voice breaking. "We have to go." But Alexander couldn't tear his gaze away from the figure. His heart ached with the loss of his friend, with the weight of everything that had happened. He had come to Cyra seeking immortality, and now he was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. "I can't," Alexander whispered, his voice trembling. "I can't leave him." Ptolemy's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too, understanding. He had seen the bond between Alexander and Hephaestion, had watched them fight side by side through every battle, every conquest. And now, in the face of the impossible, Ptolemy knew that Alexander would never leave Hephaestion behind. But Hephaestion was already gone. The ground trembled again, the crack beneath them widening, and Ptolemy made a decision. He grabbed Alexander by the shoulders, his grip firm, and looked him in the eye. "You can't save him, Alexander. He's gone. But we're still alive. We can still make it out of here." Alexander's breath hitched in his throat, his heart breaking. He knew Ptolemy was right. Hephaestion was lost, and if he stayed, if he allowed the curse to take him too, then everything they had fought for would be for nothing. But the pull of Cyra was too strong. The statues were almost upon them now, their massive forms looming over the desert, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. The crack beneath them had grown wider, the earth splitting open like a hungry mouth. "You are the king of Cyra," the whispers hissed. "You belong to us." Alexander closed his eyes, his body trembling with the weight of the curse. He could feel it now, deep inside, the truth of what he had become. He was no longer just a man. He was part of Cyra, bound to the city for all eternity. But even in the darkness, even as the curse threatened to consume him, Alexander made one final choice. He wouldn't let the city win. With a sudden burst of strength, Alexander tore free from Ptolemy's grasp and turned to face the statues, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I am not yours," he shouted, his voice ringing out over the howling wind. "I will never be yours." The ground shook violently, the statues freezing in place as if stunned by the force of Alexander's words. The crack beneath them widened, the desert splitting open as the very earth rebelled against the ancient curse. Ptolemy reached for Alexander, his voice filled with desperation. "Alexander, no!" But Alexander stood firm, his gaze locked on the statues, on the figure of Hephaestion standing just beyond them. He could feel the curse tightening around him, the pull of Cyra stronger than ever, but he refused to let it take him. With one final cry, Alexander stepped forward, toward the abyss. The ground gave way beneath him, the earth swallowing him whole, and in that moment, as the darkness closed in, Alexander knew that he had won. He had defied the city. He had broken the cycle. The last thing he saw was Hephaestion's face, twisted into a smile that was no longer his. And then, there was nothing. Epilogue: The Return. The Macedonian camp was a frenzy of anxious movement and low murmurs. The men had been restless for hours, their nerves stretched thin by the unforgiving desert, by the unknown fate of their king, and by the whispers of the cursed city. Fires flickered in the twilight, casting long, jittery shadows across the camp as soldiers exchanged uneasy glances and whispered their fears in hushed tones. At the center of it all, Ptolemy struggled to maintain control. His voice, hoarse from shouting commands, barely cut through the tense atmosphere. "Steady yourselves. We will hold until we know more." His words were firm, but they did little to quiet the creeping doubt that had settled like a cold fog over the camp. His own heart was heavy with uncertainty. Too much time had passed since Alexander and Hephaestion had gone into the cursed city. Men paced near the perimeter, their eyes darting to the horizon, as if expecting some unknown horror to rise from the sands and descend upon them at any moment. Horses shifted restlessly, their hooves stamping into the dirt as they snorted and whinnied, sensing the unease that gripped the camp. A sharp voice rang out from the edge of the camp. "Look!" A lookout stood at attention, his arm rigid as he pointed into the distance. All eyes turned as one, head snapping toward the open desert beyond the campfires. There, far beyond the last flicker of light, two silhouettes emerged from the deepening dusk, hazy and indistinct at first, but unmistakably human. The murmur of the soldiers grew louder, uncertainty and hope mingling as they strained their eyes to make sense of the figures approaching out of the vast emptiness. The firelight wavered, casting flickering halos around the figures, making it difficult to discern whether they were real or illusions conjured by the desert's cruel tricks. Ptolemy stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He narrowed his eyes, trying to focus on the shapes moving closer with a slow, deliberate pace. The forms were familiar, too familiar. He could see the height, the stride, the regal bearing of the one in front. His breath caught in his throat. "Alexander," he whispered, the name barely escaping his lips. The camp fell into a tense, waiting silence. No one moved. The only sound was the crackling of the campfires, the restless snorts of the horses, and the distant shuffle of sand beneath the approaching figures' feet. As the two silhouettes drew nearer, their shapes became clearer. The one in front, tall and commanding, was unmistakably Alexander. His form seemed both weary and resolute, like a man who had walked through a nightmare but returned with a purpose. But there was something strange about him, something no one could yet put into words. Behind him, the second figure followed closely, smaller but just as familiar. Hephaestion. Ptolemy's heart raced. The murmurs among the men grew louder, some filled with hope, others tinged with fear. He glanced back at the soldiers, unsure of what to say, unsure if he should speak at all. His mind spun with questions, with dread, with the awful feeling that something was wrong. As they came into full view, a heavy silence settled over the camp. Alexander and Hephaestion, their faces still obscured by shadow, walked slowly and without a word, their movements almost unnatural. Every soldier watched with bated breath, the air thick with tension, as the figures approached, their steps measured and deliberate. Then, in the stillness, Alexander raised his hand. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. It hung in the air like a solemn greeting or a command. No one spoke. No one moved. Every man in the camp, Ptolemy included, felt it, the unshakable sense that something had changed, something had come with them out of the desert, something that did not belong to the world they knew. And in the suffocating silence, as the wind seemed to die and the flames flickered uncertainly, every soldier looked up, their eyes drawn to the figure of their king, waiting.